Hi, everyone, and thank you for joining our latest productivity talk, organized by the Asian Productivity Organization, or APO, where we feature guests who do interesting work at the nexus of policy, production, and technology in Asia and beyond. This is Polchait Kroper-Yoon, and I'm with the Digital Programs and Information Unit, as well as the Public Sector Unit of the APO. Over the past decade, we have seen a remarkable story of innovation play out worldwide. The electrification of transport, shown by the rise of Elon Musk, Tesla Motors and their electric cars, has become a major global trend and a talking point. However, there are also voices today that suggest that the most transformative technology in the mobility sector are not these electric cars or autonomous vehicles, but lightweight electric vehicles, which are grouped under the name micromobility. So, what exactly is micromobility, and why is it so important for the transport sector in Asia Pacific and around the world? To answer this question today, we have Oliver Bruce, co-host of the Micromobility Podcast and Conference from Micromobility Industries. He has an expertise in micromobility, mobility as a service, and has experience advising governments and investing in businesses related to transport, as well as climate change mitigation and adaptation tech. Thank you for joining us today, Oliver.
You're most welcome. It's lovely to be here.
So before we get into it, let's talk a little bit about your background. How did you come to be interested in micromobility?
Yeah, well, look, as you so generously mentioned in your intro, my background's actually in climate change. I was lucky enough to be a student delegate representative in Copenhagen in 2009, and there it was really clear to me. It was like we need to be making really big changes in transport, especially working out how to rapidly decarbonize our transport. So I ended up at Uber. In the Australia-New Zealand or Australasian organization, working on mobility as a service and trying to help reduce carbon emissions through changing the business model really around cars and saying, hey, if we can get people into lower emissions cars and then over time, hopefully be able to provide a service so that they can give up their cars, then maybe we would be able to drive emissions down. But actually, once I left there, I was really looking around for things that could really radically reduce the amount of emissions per kilometer that people travel. And I was looking around at what vehicles were emerging that could enable that. And that's where myself and my co-host for the Micromobility Podcast, Horace Dediu, really did quite a lot of work and analysis to really uncover this sort of rapidly growing but completely unrecognized space of electric bikes and scooters. And in that, we started producing a podcast and now run the Micromobility Conference as well, which is sort of the premier conference on this globally that covers electric vehicles that go up to about 500 kilograms.
Great. And I guess the place that it makes most sense to start is to explain to everyone what exactly is micromobility. And so please, if you want to get into that.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, look, I might just pull up some slides if that's okay with you. And,
sure, yeah, please do.
Yeah, excellent. Well, look, I guess the other point that maybe might just be very useful to provide a little bit of context on is also Horace as well, my co-host. So, so Horace is trained under Clayton Christensen at Harvard University. And you may know Clayton because he was the one who came up with the term disruptive innovation.
Yeah.
And so Horace was a sort of star student back in the 90s when he was writing the book, The Innovator's Dilemma, and then went off to Nokia and really made his name actually as the kind of analyst who, when the iPhone came out, he said, look, this is a really big deal. This is a new computing platform, and the smartphone is actually going to be a whole new, it's not just another phone, it's actually a whole new paradigm for computing. And wrote about it in the early days. And so he comes to this not just with a framework of, hey, what's cool in the kind of vehicle space or something. He's coming to this with a really rigorous analysis, having also gone back to work at Clayton Christensen Institute, looking at technology adaptation curves. So what are the circumstances and kind of conditions that are required for vehicles to be, new technologies to be adopted and then scaled in society? And he tracked, while he was there, as a part of the book he was writing, about 140 different technologies and the kind of conditions that were there for them to be able to get to widespread adoption. So it was from that place that we both ended up looking at micromobility, and Horace has identified a number of really interesting criteria for why micromobility comes about. And really, having come from that computing world explains a lot about why we think micromobility is interesting. So the kind of key thing for Horace was that he looked at the drop in costs for GPS, batteries, motors, networks, and smartphones, and could see that, what we've had sort of 10,000x return or sort of improvement on some of the early componentry that we were putting into smartphones, and that they call it the peace dividends of the smartphone wars, the complete competition between Apple and Android to drive down the cost of these electronics, then finding their ways into vehicles. And so the way that we classify micromobility is that they are vehicles that are electric. They are typically utility. So we're not just talking about recreational vehicles. We're not talking about sort of people going out and buying motorbikes to ride down, go for recreational trips on it. No, it's things where you can do a job, and they are lightweight. So we use the framework of anything that's in the sort of sub 500 kilogram category. Now, the reason that we look at that is that you can see here, this here is a graph of all vehicles sold in France from 2012 to 2015. And it's mapped on the y-axis by CO2 grams per kilometer, and on the x-axis by vehicle mass. Now, what you can see is that there's a really clear correlation between vehicle mass and CO2 emissions for the vehicle. But we don't see vehicles that are under about 1,000 kilograms. In actual fact, there's almost nothing below 500 kilograms. And then you have right at the bottom, in the bottom left-hand corner of the graph, you've got walking, cycling, e-bikes, and solar cars and e-scooters. And what Horace recognized was that there's a space that exists in vehicles where, with these new technologies and the rapidly dropping cost of them as well, what we can see is that there's a design space for smaller vehicles that can exist on the road that will have the performance of things that that would be able to solve the job to be done of someone who's maybe looking to have a car. So the scope of micromobility is not just electric bikes and scooters, though oftentimes I think it's categorized as that. It goes right through to e-mopeds, to these things, kind of heavier cargo bikes that allow for urban deliveries, for example, at scale, and through to these vehicles on the right here called the Nimbus, which I'll talk about a bit today, which is about a 400 kilogram, 450 kilogram three-wheeler in this particular case. So there are four-wheelers as well, new electric vehicles coming out of China that are four wheels that are about 500 or so kilograms. Hopefully that explains the sort of the kind of the framing of micromobility. I think the key point as well as to why it matters is that we were onto something, I think, quite early at Uber, and you can see that Uber has kind of become a buzzword for a lot of disruption and all that sort of thing. But what we identified was that if you could provide a service to folks that actually meant reliably they knew they could get a car, it took people away from saying, I have to have a second car, I can't rely on taxis, to, hey, I know that there's always going to be a vehicle available. And there were a couple of reasons for that with Uber as to why that mattered. But the mobility as a service, the ability to be able to walk about, have a smartphone, use the technology that's in the smartphone to enable access to these vehicles is, I think, really key and important to where we think the world is going in our thesis at micromobility.
Some of this all fair, but you were mentioning about kind of the idea of technology enabling a kind of unbundling the car. I think it's like a metaphor about a drill.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so the job to be done, the thesis of job to be done is something that's sort of core to Horace and also Clayton Christensen came up with it, but Horace oftentimes talks about it. What is the job to be done of a car? Well, a job to be done of a car is really you pay $30,000 or $40,000 for the optionality of walking out the front of your house and knowing for the 5,000 trips that you're going to take with that car over the life of the ownership, you can walk out the front, have a car, and know that you can get somewhere. And it's, you take the trade-offs with all of that. You have to pay for insurance, you have to pay for gas, you have to get in traffic, and it's all very frustrating. And in actual fact, car ownership, while everybody loves it for the things that it enables, is also a real hassle. And if we could get to a point, ultimately someone buys built a drill because they want a hole in the wall. That the job to be done is the hole in the wall, not the drill. And so what Horace and Clayton really identified in the disruptive innovation theory was the need for being able to actually go back and ask the question, what is the job to be done? And the thing that micromobility really does better than anything else in our argument is that it enables you to be able to get through a city, especially a highly congested and constrained city, probably quicker than anything else, and at a very, very low cost per kilometer. Yes, it's not perfect on a lot of other metrics. People will argue an e-bike is not the same as a car. You're going to get rained on. You're going to have all these other things. It's like, yes, I completely agree with you. But if you look at the job to be done, which is purely how do you get from place A to place B the fastest in a highly congested city, oftentimes micromobility is by far the best option that's available.
Great. And since you've started to get into it, I wonder if we can start talking about, I think your team has a pretty strong thesis about all of the kind of advantages that make micromobility solutions so disruptive or so transformative. So maybe we can get into kind of that comprehensive package.
Yeah, absolutely. So in terms of why it matters, when you really go and look at how trips happen, how do people actually travel? Most trips are short, and that was a kind of an interesting thing that we kind of noted when we were doing our initial research into this, which is that the trip distribution curve, like 50% of trips are less than 5 miles in the US, and in Asia and a lot of other countries, it's actually even shorter than that. And yet, what we end up doing is taking really, really large cars, vehicles that are really kind of quite over-serving for what we need to do, which is oftentimes we just need to move ourselves 3 or 5 kilometers down the road, and we will end up traveling not only ourselves, but 2,000 kilograms of metal around us with 3 extra seats. And we do that because that is often the only vehicle that's available to us. But the impacts of that is that you end up with significant amounts of congestion. And so this here is obviously a picture. I think that one is from Jakarta. But certainly if you look at around Asia, they have some of the most congested cities in the world. And yet, when you really think about it, what we're doing is we're moving some people from point A to point B. And so when you look at the traditional options that have been available for folks to be able to transport themselves around a city, you have the car, and oftentimes people really like their car because it offers freedom, which is it says I can get from point A to point B without having kind of additional trips on either end. You can take a bike or you can take a bus. Now, both of those have disadvantages. Where we think micromobility has an option is that it offers a new way to be able to do the point-to-point transport, but in a way that you don't end up sweaty if you're on a bike, for example, because electric power can facilitate you to be able to get from one place to another. And it provides that ability to travel in those short trips, how most people actually travel most of the time. And so what we can see is that there's a gap that exists for these vehicles, similar to how, Jam, in your early days of having a smartphone, I'm sure it wasn't as good as your laptop, but in your very early days of you ended up, the smartphone became more and more kind of capable, and you ended up using it more and more and more for your computing tasks relative to your laptop. And what we can see is that we think there will be an emergence of vehicles that will be very similar to the smartphone in the world of transport. It will not require it will not be a one size fits all, but there will be additional and new trips that you will be enabled to do in the same way that we were able to do new computing tasks with smartphones that we couldn't do even with laptops.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. And maybe you're sort of hinting at one of the dimensions here, but APO is a productivity-focused organization. Maybe you can make explicit kind of what are all of the advantages for micromobility vehicles in terms of productivity.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, the first is kind of very clear to me, which is that it's speed. So if you look at ways to get across a city that's highly congested, an e-scooter and e-bike. This is a study from Barclays that was looking at typical speeds across a city in New York. And you can see here that the e-scooter travels at 10 miles per hour. It's significantly faster than anything else that's available. An e-bike is 15 miles an hour. So, and also as well at a very low level of cost. I should point that out. So what you end up with is by far the better, the best option for being able to unlock productivity is really just reducing the amount of travel time or unproductive time that a person would spend during a day, but also not having that hit their wallet really hard, that they're able to do that at a low cost. The second is really around infrastructure cost as well. So this is from something called the Mobility Disruption Framework from a venture capitalist called Olaf Sackers. And he went through and ranked what they called the throughput construction cost of various transportation infrastructure. So one of the things that we oftentimes see, and certainly I live in New Zealand, we have this conversation happening at the moment, is around things like light rail or subways, and installing light rails and subways in our transport system. And they work really well for throughput capacity in the sense of they can move a lot of people per kilometer and per hour once they're built. But they are incredibly expensive to build, and they really only work in certain areas. What you can see here is that micromobility, the infrastructure cost of micromobility is incredibly low, and yet it also allows for really high levels of throughput. So from a cost perspective, it really pays to go and build infrastructure that has a really high ROI if you can. So obviously, bus, rapid transit, micromobility, and pedestrian show to be that have the kind of the best scores here in terms of what you'd call TCC. Versus, for example, a mixed traffic road, for example, that has not a very high level of throughput and quite a high cost of construction. And I'm happy to continue on into transport costs as well, if you'd like. Yeah, absolutely. So the other one that's obviously, as I alluded to, was transport costs. Now this here is from Stats New Zealand. It's referring to New Zealand, but it is the case in most countries around the world, which is transport is the third largest living cost in terms of household expenditure. So incredibly sensitive to fuel prices, for example, and as we can see, which is what's happened during the Ukraine crisis here, the price of oil has gone through the roof. And so being able to provide alternative options for folks to be able to ensure that we one can move around the city in a way that's effective and resilient to oil or fuel supply shocks, but also being able to do it in a way that impacts them on the bottom line in a household expenditure is incredibly important, I think. And that really comes about just because the energy consumption per kilometer is really low. And now Horace has developed something called he calls it the modicum of transport, or what is the unit that is required in order to be able to move a human being through an urban environment on a per kilometer basis per passenger. So you can see an electric kick scooter or an e-bike score incredibly well on that metric, and you can see the Nimbus or the e-Pod, which we'll talk about again in a little while. That also scores. It's about 1/3 the energy intensity of moving a Tesla Model 3 through a city as well, versus something like a Cadillac CTS-V, which is a very large kind of internal combustion car as well. So the benefits really exist in terms of being able to reduce energy consumption for each kilometer traveled of a population, and that flows through into things like emissions. So 25% of trips. 25% of kilometers traveled are responsible. Sorry, the emissions that are generated on trips that are less than 5 miles is about 25% of all emissions, and about 50% of all trips emissions come under trips that are about 12.5 miles long or something like that. So we can see that there are really significant benefits that will come from being able to effectively put on small trips, use small vehicles, and on big trips, use, big vehicles. And just being able to mate the user demand, or the how people actually want to use and travel with the appropriate vehicle, we think is one that would really unlock a lot of efficiencies and productivity benefits for a lot of countries that are looking to be able to move forward.
Yeah, so I'd love to get maybe to give people a more visceral sense of what the world would look like if micromobility kind of dominates the transport system. Because as so far as you've been talking about it now, it seems like it's generally a solution just for mostly urban environments where things are kind of densely packed. You get the worst kind of congestion. There's a kind of relationship between what a city looks like and what the kind of means to get around is. So I think we had a conversation before recording about, how much of a city is basically just parking lots or places for people to park their cars. And of course, you also have things like the cul-de-sac, suburbs.
Yes,
The
exactly.
connection between these outer laying areas and kind of the main city. So in a world with micromobility, these scooters, these kind of things like the Nimbus, what does the city look like?
Yeah. Well, look, I'm just going to see if I can pull up an appropriate slide
Sure.
to be able to talk to this. But effectively, what you end up with is in a city which is highly car dependent, which is a lot of the Australian, New Zealand, or what you'd call countries that were built up post World War II, and aren't these sort of Asian megacities. So what you can kind of the suburban or suburb driven development. So countries like, as I mentioned, the US, some areas of Europe, Australia, New Zealand, etc., had built a very kind of sprawly urban form. And the impact of that is that you end up with cities that are really spread out, and they don't have agglomeration benefits within the cities. Where micromobility offers something really interesting and really valuable is that oftentimes in the more dense cities, they have been built around very fixed subway lines or very fixed transportation options, and that can not always work to their benefit. So, for example, you've seen in New York City, for example, Manhattan is incredibly well serviced by transit lines. But for example, Brooklyn has only 2 or 3 transit lines that run through them, and they don't have cross transit lines. So there's what they call a real issue with transport poverty or transport deserts that are very common. And it comes about through kind of a lack of planning. When you're building out cities, but we can see that happening in a lot of countries around the world. That there's challenges, especially in the very fast-growing metropolises in Asia. That there's intention to put in transport lines, but oftentimes they can take a very long time to build. They are challenging they're kind of being retrofitted into a city as it's kind of already exploding in growth. And so you do end up with these transport deserts or these challenges of these places that you cannot. That the transport from one place to another in the city to another requires going through a central hub that's kind of quite far out from where you'd want it to be. And so an option like micromobility, which can move through the city quickly and is pleasant, hopefully, is an option that we think just purely from a geometric perspective, the size of a micromobility vehicle is typically 1 to 2 square meters on the road versus a car, which is about 10 square meters. So you just have the ability to slip through these congested areas and be able to get from one place in the city to another. And we think that will unlock real productivity benefits for a whole range of people, including access to jobs or in terms of being able to remap, for example, things like the rental or housing markets, which at the moment are oftentimes very agglomerated. There's a very high price that's paid for apartments or housing that's very near big transport lines, and that's due to access to jobs. The micromobility has an option to actually remap some of that out. That if you can get from one side of the city to the other without having to rely on public transport, and you can slip through in a way that doesn't have you kind of impacted by congestion, then you oftentimes are able to access kind of new and exciting employment opportunities that we think are really beneficial. In terms of what works, the kind of the enablers for micromobility, obviously the big one is around transit-oriented development. We do still think that micromobility that traditional public transport has a very important role to play. And that's oftentimes because being able to travel long distances, especially, to other areas that are where there is agglomerated benefits. So for example, being close to a transport station and then being able to go down the road to something that you might want to be able to enjoy the city or to be able to get to a job, that can still be really beneficial. And it means that people would say, I don't feel the need to necessarily own a car because I can kind of accent that by owning these other small vehicles that can allow me to better explore the area that I'm in. The next one is really infrastructure. So building electric, bike lanes or lanes that enable these smaller vehicles to be ridden safely and not have to fight for their space on the road. Anybody who's ridden an e-bike or a scooter, especially in kind of very congested areas, can really attest to the challenges of, just you're fighting against something that's 20 times your weight. So you really want to be able to have a protected area so that people feel safe. And the way that that's typically measured is the infrastructure enabling someone from the ages of 8 to 80 to feel safe to be able to ride their vehicle through a kind of a town or a city in a way that is really, makes them feel safe and enabled. And then the temperate climate matters more for the open air and the low cost versions, for example, e-bikes and e-scooters. And there are options very similar to the Nimbus. And actually, Paul, do you mind if I just show that video of the Nimbus? Would that be a good time
I think that'd be
show it
helpful
now?
now.
So you can see here, this is a vehicle that's in development at the moment. And it's developed by an American company, but looking for manufacturing partners in Asia, actually, who are building an enclosed three-wheeler. The kind of key innovation that they've managed to do here is that they've got a tilting mechanism that allows the vehicle to have a small footprint at the front. So it's only 80 centimeters or between 80 and 90 centimeters wide. It seats one person with a tandem secondary seat in the back for folks who might want to be able to do it to sit a small child or take their groceries or whatever. But it's enclosed, and the price point for this is sort of $6,000, which $6,000 to $7,000, which for a lot of a lot of cities around the world will actually be a quite cost-effective vehicle for a lot of people to be able to purchase. It's not a car, and it is, but it would work with a highly congested environment and at the same time be able to insulate you against things like temperate climates. If you don't have a temperate climate, if you are in a really hot space and you need air conditioning, or you're in a really cold space and you want to have cover from the rain and the snow, etc.
So I guess what I'm wondering now is with things like the Nimbus, because kind of day to day, the sort of micromobility things I've seen kind of on the streets in Tokyo or in Bangkok they tend to be based around kind of ride sharing, where you open up an app and then you can kind of temporarily use a scooter or an electric bike or something like that. With the Nimbus, would they operate under that same model? Is it more like a car in the sense that people would own one?
Yeah, that's a great question. We can see. So Nimbus is not the only company working on these three-wheelers. There are a couple of other companies that I can point to as well. Arcimoto being kind of one of the biggest operators in the States. They're building one. It doesn't tilt at the moment, but it's still a three-wheeler, and it has some level of enclosure to it as well. But the key thing that I think we're going to see from these is that the price point. I mean, if Nimbus is able to hit a $6,000 price point as they intend, and as they've done the bill of materials, all of the things that are that would be required to be able to build a vehicle like that would make sense to be able to have a price point like that. Then the biggest people who we have seen who are interested in these are, for example, the food delivery companies who want to be able to provide a way for their employers or their workers to be able to get around a city in a way that keeps them protected and allows them to be able to move. And then I imagine there will be, the other largest is a group that we know are very interested in this, are the shared micromobility providers. So, the Beams, the Limes, the Birds, the other companies that are very interested in this space. And that's because for them, they would be able to put one of those vehicles on at about so a standard scooter is about $600, $700. You could put that on and earn significantly more than you would on a standard scooter. And certainly from a car share perspective, if you're competing with a car share company, you've got a vehicle now that allows you to really become kind of integral. You're competing with a car share company with a vehicle that really has just a very different benefit that a standard person wouldn't be able to access with the car share. So we do think that shared is going to be a very important part of how these sort of vehicles end up being used. And the interesting and kind of really beneficial fact about that is that for every single shared car that goes on the road, typically you take anywhere from like 6 to 10 cars off the road in terms of the vehicles that you would otherwise have. Again, it goes back to what we talked about in the beginning. The job to be done of a car is to sit out the front of my house so that when I walk outside, I can get one when I need one. And if you have a low enough price point that we can see that's coming with these vehicles in micromobility, then there should be a low enough cost price point that there should be enough of them available that you will always be able to find either a scooter or a vehicle like this when you need it. Even in the more kind of dispersed areas and sprawly areas, not like right in a downtown where there's, natural and easy agglomeration of lots of people and the ability to be able to build a service like that.
Right. And so you've talked about enablers. Are there things that make it difficult for micromobility to work?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, natural one is the weather, and this is certainly the Nordic countries have managed to get through this just with a cultural change. I think that might be slightly more challenging in really hot temperate really hot climates. But I do think that there are vehicles similar to the Vimo or again the Nimbus that are coming that will have air conditioning and the ability to be able to provide a climate controlled environment. Certainly, the economics of shared services in the past have not been particularly beneficial, have been a barrier. Things like theft and vandalism and lifespan, etc. I do want to point out that those early days are really over. Like all of the operators these days that are operating, if they've made it through and survived, now really have solutions to all of those. And what you're seeing is these companies are starting to become certainly break even, if not profitable, and building quite wonderful little businesses in that space. The other one as well is that the barriers that micromobility really exists in a weird space, which is we have dedicated infrastructure for cars, we have parking for cars, we have all of the benefit of 100 years of having this technology. These technologies being able to move ourselves around cities with these vehicles, and you intuit we're infusing into this habitat, if you call it that, these new vehicles that have kind of different characteristics. You can't the sort of natural one for people is to say, look, I want to ride my scooter and I want to park it wherever I want. And in actual fact, there's a long history of this. When new vehicles get introduced to cities. We're too young to now remember it, but there was actually really big problems with parking when cars arrived, which is why we now have parking and parking enforcement and parking garages, and all of those things only emerged after the car had come along. And we can see similar emergences of parking infrastructure and new ways of storing and making it sort of socially acceptable, but also providing the space for these vehicles to be stored appropriately. Within a city context as well. And the final one is really safety. And that's, the challenge that we have is that oftentimes these vehicles are two wheels, and that two wheels, they can be dangerous. They are statistically more dangerous than, for example, a car that is able to offer more protection. So There are a lot of technologies that are coming in terms of ways that you can have the two-wheeler be able to self-balance, a lot of computer vision, or new ways of being able to control the vehicle so that you can infuse that computation into the vehicle and improve the safety. One of the big things that we're going to be presenting on in micromobility, we are having companies present on at Micromobility in Europe and in the States has been computer vision. So being able to identify an obstacle in front of it and have the scooter or the vehicle stop before it hits anything. And all of that innovation happens in micromobility faster than it does in standard cars or standard automobiles, just because the life cycle of the vehicles and the time to development is a lot faster than what we have in the automobile space as well. So I'm very confident that we will make that, when combined with good quality infrastructure, the safety specs and experience of these new vehicles actually substantially better than other options in time. But it will take a little bit of time.
Right. So thanks for touching on those points. It does remind me when we were talking about kind of unbundling or the job to do for a car, at least I know from living and growing up in Bangkok, one of the parts of the car or job of a car is actually to provide air conditioning. Basically, it's as much of an atmosphere environment control service as it is a transport service.
Oh, totally.
It's interesting to touch on that and how certain kinds of micromobility vehicles are kind of better positioned to deal with that issue. One thing that you didn't mention but I think you would have a lot to say about is the role of regulation or licensing as either an enabler or a kind of constraint. So obviously, I'm thinking, a car, there's a whole traditional licensing system. It's very developed. People kind of have a very clear understanding of, what you can do, who can drive a car, who can't drive a car. But these sort of ride sharing services, these scooters, there's a kind of, I don't know, regulatory gray space. Is it like a motorcycle? Is it not? So maybe you could comment on that.
Yeah, so this is a great question, and one that I know that the Society of Automotive Engineers, SAE, have been working on quite closely, and we actually contributed to their early research in 2019 about this. In terms of defining what is micromobility, how do they define it? What is going to be the licensing and import requirements as well? And so I do think that there is, what we have with this combination of new technologies, that the combination of batteries and motors and everything, is that there is a kind of Cambrian explosion, is the term that I like to use, of these new vehicles that are going to emerge, and it'll be completely new vehicle types that we haven't ever seen before, just because they are enabled in a way that not only from the vehicle, but actually if you go back even further, it's in terms of things like manufacturing. Being able to build a small, low-cost run of things when you're using modular components is far easier to do than it has been, for example, than to get to go out and effectively design a car and build a production run of a vehicle, knowing that you have to stamp the steel and make the engines and build a large company around that, including being able to provide servicing, et cetera, et cetera. All of that is we are facing right now with the emergence of these new vehicle types. So, I think there's very valid questions from governments who are looking at the space going, hey, what's the power cutoff at which we say you don't need a license or you do need a license? The standard has been from Europe and from the US has been, it's anywhere from 250 to 750 watts of power on the vehicle. But there is also these other kind of emergent spaces, and the Nimbus and the Arcimoto are examples of this, where you have a kind of weird regulatory gray area. Now, the Nimbus is a very interesting vehicle, and one of the reasons I like it so much is there is a weird auto classification called an autocycle. Now, an autocycle was originally developed by the Italians for something called the Piaggio Ape back in the 40s and 50s, which is a three-wheeled kind of truck that would go through the streets of Rome. And Piaggio had developed it for these small streets in Rome. And because of the fact that the Italians are so kind of central to car making, along with the French, and developed the auto classification system, the autocycle is now a kind of recognized standard in most countries around the world. So something like a Nimbus is able to be developed and built it sits in this already defined category that just has had no vehicles developed in it. But all of a sudden, because you now are able to build and kind of produce vehicles in a way that's very capital efficient relative to other previous examples of having to develop it with internal combustion engines and develop with the kind of the new additive manufacturing technologies that we can do today. What you're seeing is that there is new vehicles that are popping up, and I think are going to be new hits that we never would have seen before or couldn't have seen before. I do think it also, specifically to your point around licensing, we are going to see a very interesting development as well, because it's going to be oftentimes these vehicles are not regulated or not registerable when they come into a country. And so we do know that there are new vehicles that are coming that are oftentimes not registered, but would be considered incredibly dangerous. And that also, I think, is just part of the teething pains and the problems and the challenges that we're going to see as this space grows very quickly.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think, you're starting to segue onto another topic that I think is very interesting. So there's a kind of interesting opportunity available for certain Asian Pacific countries that are kind of have a expertise in kind of manufacturing, but maybe not to the standard of manufacturing kind of full vehicles, full cars, which is kind of like a very kind of advanced sort of manufacturing, especially as cars kind of approach the level of like they're almost as complicated as computers now.
Yeah, completely.
So maybe you could touch on that opportunity.
Yeah, absolutely. So one thing that both Horace and I have really noted in the development of the space has been that countries that traditionally wouldn't have been in auto manufacturing, or auto manufacturing is it's a very particular game. There are only a certain number of countries around the world that actually, even now, still maintain auto manufacturing capabilities. And the reason for that is that they're incredibly capital intensive, that they oftentimes require quite involved government support. So the countries that you can see that are manufacturing vehicles around the world, is China. There is one that's now being supported, and there's been the development of Indian car manufacturers, and Malaysia, and it's a small amount in Indonesia. But for example, a lot of smaller states would not be able to get into vehicle manufacturing without really substantial government support, and oftentimes governments just don't have that capability. What we have seen is that the emergence of these smaller vehicles has enabled really countries that traditionally haven't been in the space to be able to get into manufacturing of vehicles. And so some examples that I can give you are India in particular areas, which I'll get into in a second, or Taiwan. In Europe, it would be Estonia or Portugal, which again, some of them had traditionally had some level of vehicle manufacturing, but not much. And then other places around the world as well. So we can see that there is a new if you have any sort of levels of supply chain capabilities in the smartphone space or electronic space, being able to say, hey, we can pivot into this and be able to build new vehicles, as I think a really interesting opportunity. And I want to point out very specifically the one from Ola. So Ola is similar to a Grab or an Uber. It started out as a rideshare company, but it decided about 3 years ago it was going to get into micromobility. And so it took a small position in a shared operator, and then they came out of it and said, actually, you know what? The biggest opportunity here is for us to become the manufacturer of the next generation of vehicle for India. And so they went from a kind of nothing to building the world's largest, or one of the world's largest, electric moped manufacturing sites in Bangalore, which will do about 10 million units a year in about 3 years. So that's a really interesting leapfrog, in my perspective, of being able to get into vehicle manufacturing in a way. India has a long history of trying to get into interesting automotive experiments. I always loved the Tata Nano; it was an amazing car. I wish it had been more of a success. But we can see that actually vehicles like this, when you have a really low cost of acquisition, in the sense of these will sell for about $1,500 or so. But the marginal cost per kilometer for the folks who buy it will be incredibly low. we've done calculations and we think it's sort of in the region of sort of anywhere from 10 to 20 cents per kilometer, which is an order of magnitude lower than car ownership when you take into account all of the costs. So we can see that there's going to be a huge number of people. When you look at like where the population growth is going to happen in the world over the next 20 to 30 years, most of the world is going to be going, most of that growth is going to come from Asia or Asia Minor, and that will end up with a lot of those folks saying, we want to be able to get mobilized. We don't want to have to rely only on public transport for our own transport costs. We don't want to get a car because a car is actually really frustrating, but we are in an urban environment, and so it makes sense for us to be able to get access to a vehicle. And a lot of those folks will turn to a shared service. They will be able to access that vehicle when they need it, or they will purchase it and be able to get it, such as this in India. From Ola. And the second is, as I mentioned, Nimbus. So a couple of things about it. It'll have a 120 kilometer range. It will have a swappable battery system similar to Gogoro. Will have a 80 to 100 kilometer an hour top speed, so it's able to be conformable to the existing infrastructure, but with a very, very small footprint. So 2 square meters versus 10. It has airbags. It has basic ADAS. And it's enclosed from the weather. And the thing that's really interesting is that they reckon that they will be able to get to production for about $30 to $40 million. Now, a traditional car, when you go and try and get it to production, you're looking at sort of upwards of $500 million. To be able to go from sort of, hey, we've developed this concept through, we've built a factory and we're able to start producing these things. The genius and the wonder of micromobility, we think, is that you can get a vehicle out into market for $30 to $40 million. The Arcimoto is another one up in the US. That was done in the US with US kind of cost points, and they still managed to get to production for about $45 to $50 million US. So we just sort of note that from a productivity perspective, it's a really, really cool and kind of oftentimes underrepresented and misunderstood space. That there is a lot of people who would look at this and say, oh, look, these are toys. They're not very interesting. And I just want to go back to one slide that I have earlier in my presentation, because I want to just show you the sort of the scale of what we're talking about here. If you look at just e-bike sales in Europe, we compare it to, for example, an electric car. Now, the electric cars, as Paul Chait kind of referenced in his introduction, get all of the attention. And I love Elon Musk. I do. I think he's wonderful. I think he's doing great things for the planet. But the scale of what the electric cars are actually doing pales in comparison to what we're seeing from our e-bike manufacturers and our entrepreneurs who are building in that space. And that's in Europe. And you can see the same thing happening in New Zealand, and it is in a lot of cases around the world as well. Actually, e-bike sales, specifically e-bikes, and this is not even mopeds or other emergent vehicle types. Those e-bikes outsold electric cars in the US last year. And actually have a faster rate of growth than electric cars too. So we can see, this opportunity that exists for folks who want to get into it. It is a non-traditional manufacturing path, because oftentimes, especially with countries in terms of their development, folks will say, look, you have to get into auto manufacturing. There's a lot of other things that will develop around that ecosystem. We make the argument that actually these electric vehicles that exist like this are a really interesting alternative means of being able to develop very productive and healthy ecosystems with high potential for growth as well.
So it seems like, from kind of looking at these trends, that micromobility as a technology is very promising. One thing that we haven't touched on directly is kind of the role of, and you mentioned the Tata Nano, which is a really interesting example, because at least the story of why it failed is they've produced a car that was so cheap that people saw it as cheap. So instead of something big, oh wow, it's this thing, like there's a job it can do and it's affordable, it was seen as kind of low status. And of course, you look at a car commercial today, playing at the Super Bowl or something like that, there's a lot of status attached to what kind of vehicle you own. So I'm wondering how people in the micromobility industry, or you specifically, have thought about these kind of more cultural questions and cultural fit, and how micromobility will kind of affect those sorts of preconceptions.
Yeah, that's a really great question. And one that certainly I, as a man in New Zealand, I have a particular view of what people are going to be interested in. But again, these vehicles need to sell, and that's how they will. That's how they'll succeed. Is not because I think they're a good idea, but because people actually want them, and we can't force them on people. Certainly, those electric bike sales, I think, are relevant, and that works in places like Europe, where there's a lot of consciousness around things like climate change, and Europe is one, New Zealand is another. But in other countries where, for example, that isn't so front of mind, I certainly think that just the congestion, there's going to be a lot of it which is just basic utility, and we certainly see it in China, which is that there's actually this whole class of vehicles called the neighborhood electric vehicle, and they're typically very low end. You're talking sort of $1,000 to $2,500 price points. There's a whole range of them that have emerged. They only go to 50 kilometers an hour, and they don't require driver's licenses, and they only have a range of about 50 kilometers. So we actually don't know the size of the industry because they're not tracked, but they're certainly considered low status, and that's one of the things that I think we will see is that a lot of micromobility will start off as low status. I do think, however, that the performance that we're seeing out of these vehicles, in the sense of, why do people buy Teslas? I actually own a Tesla. The reason I own it is because it's fast. I don't own it because, there's something in it about, it's good for the environment. Mainly I own it because it goes 0 to 103 seconds. And it's very cool. And I can see that there are going to be vehicles that emerge in the space that are just going to outperform anything that you can see, that you can buy in the traditional vehicle space. Certainly something like a Nimbus or an Arcimoto, I think, get very interesting. The Nimbus especially so. If you can turn up, you just imagine it. You're in Manila. You need to get from one side of town to the other. Your options are you go and catch a bus, or you take an Uber. You're stuck in traffic the entire time, or you get access to. You can walk up to something like a Nimbus. You hop into it. It's air conditioned. You rent it for $5-6 an hour equivalent. Zoom across the city, be able to get to your meeting on time, and you turn up completely, with an air conditioned pod. I can just see that will shift the discussion around status, especially if you're competing against, someone who might have ended up coming in the back of a BMW 7 Series. They turn up there, but they're there 3 hours later, because you're able to just move yourself across the city. And we just haven't had something that has emerged in that space yet. And I think when they do, that will be a renegotiation of what status is. If you can get that time back. So
yeah.
I hear you, and I completely agree, and I don't think we're going to win this by forcing this down people's throats, but I certainly think that there are opportunities in the innovation that will change the status perspective of this.
Great. And so we've heard a lot about micromobility, why it's important, what are the kind of different bottlenecks or potential challenges as a technology it might face. I'm wondering, we might want to move a little bit away from micromobility, so I can ask you a few more general questions.
Yeah, sure.
One, so I know outside of micromobility, you have a range of kind of other tech interests in the transport sector, but also I think you've done some work in kind of like decentralized finance. We talked about climate tech. Is there any other technology or kind of organization that you're particularly excited about that our audience might find useful to know about?
This is a great question. So I think there is an area of blockchain that has been relatively completely ignored for the last little while, and that's because I think a lot of crypto is largely hype. And I say that with all love, but there is an emergence of a space called staked information markets, which I think will really change the game. There's the kind of the primary kind of example of this is a group called Numerai, who are building a decentralized hedge fund in the US. But the kind of core idea behind it is that if someone approaches you on the internet and says, "Hey, I'm interested in being able to, tell you some information that I think is really valuable to you, but you need to pay me $50 for it." if I emailed you, I can guarantee you're probably going to go, who on earth is Oliver Bruce, and how, why on earth would I ever pay him $50? He's just approaching me randomly out of the internet.
Mm-hmm.
But there's a time cost involved. It's like, oh, you could go and have a look at why I might know that information, and you could look at my LinkedIn, but it would be very hard for you to be able to tell if I'd actually be good at that. And that would be $50 worth of value. Now, the alternative is I turn up and I say, hey, Portrait, look, I've got this, I've got some information I think will be really valuable to you. I have $500 staked as sort of locked up on the internet that you can see, and you can also destroy if I'm trying to effectively breach your trust, take your money and run. And I would also like you to pay me $50 for that information. All of a sudden, the economic incentives are really aligned. So it solves this problem that we have on the internet of there's no skin in the game for anybody.
Mm-hmm.
Anybody can leave a comment anywhere on the internet, and it does our absolute heads in, and I think is probably one of the biggest challenges. And when you look in the real world, you can't do that. You can't just randomly turn up in Parliament and start yelling. You have to have done some work to be able to get into Parliament in the first place. You can still yell, but there are means of signaling that you have skin in the game and that you have an interest in what's going on here. And I think that model is one that will really fix a lot of the problems around being able to build trust between different people who exist on the internet that I don't think has worked yet, but I think has the potential to emerge. And so Numerai is building a decentralized hedge fund because they want to surface information and recommendations around what they should invest in, where people can say, hey, I think you should invest in this. And I think these, you give us some data, we'll analyze it for you and come back and make a recommendation for you. And they're doing incredibly well. They're literally outperforming the entire market on a whole range of different things because they've worked out how to harness the wisdom of the crowd, but in a way that everybody has skin in the game. And that's very novel, I think.
Yeah, that sounds really interesting, and I can see how it might even connect to kind of some emerging the emerging kind of tech around, digital identification and having kind of persistent, digital identities that people can trust. One final kind of substantive question. So you've done a lot of work, kind of looking at sort of innovation, focusing on innovation, and your business partner Horace has also done the same. What kind of would you say there are kind of specific attributes or ways of thinking about things or kind of models that you hold in your head that help people find kind of innovation and maybe specifically like disruptive innovation? What are kind of good personality attributes or good ways to think about things that help you find these kind of gaps in the market?
Totally. I mean, one of the most interesting books I think I ever read was a book called The Origin of Wealth. And it was written by Eric Beinhocker. And Eric is now the director of the Institute for New Economic Studies.
I'm familiar with it.
Yeah, INET. Yeah. So, and he wrote this book in 2006. And anybody who's read *Sapiens* in the sort of more recent years about, hey, look, everything's just a story. We're mimetic creatures, and humans take cues from each other about how everything works, and we're really just trying to convince everybody. It's really a question of like, how do we most convincingly convince everybody else that this is the truth? He used that to be able to explain complexity economics, and that to me, complexity economics explains so much about the world. It's about human beings over time have become more and more sophisticated and more complex in our organization. And really, the tools for that are about our ability to take kind of physical technologies. So things like, hey, I know how to actually make steel, and I know how to make thermoplastics or whatever it is, and then combining it with the soft technology, so law and language and cultural norms, etc. And in that regard, I think the internet can be viewed in that regard as one kind of amazing thing where we've plugged ourselves into a global internet kind of brain. There's a global brain that's available. I think there's lots about it that's completely chaotic and not really good for us. But I also think over time, we will build systems that actually allow us, similar to what I was mentioning with Numerai and the idea of staked information markets, where we can surface the really relevant and valuable information and the truth, that like information, truth with a capital T, to be able to really kind of propel society forward and become a really productive group of, that enable us to become really productive and be able to unlock our potential as a human race. So look, I'm net positive on the especially on something like climate. I used to be very negative. I used to think we were really in trouble. But something like micromobility, I think, is an example of where innovation comes together with really just kind of going back to those nuts and bolts questions. Like, what is the job to be done? How can we actually service the job to be done in a way that actually gets us out of something like a climate emergency? Because I think people until now have assumed that the world will continue to look exactly as it always has. It will just be an extrapolation. And I actually think that, disruptive innovation frameworks like the one that Clay also developed, when combined with things like complexity economics, really can map us a world in which we end up seeing potential solutions and innovations that will really get us to the next level and solve these climate challenges that we face.
Great. And I've really enjoyed the conversation I've had with you. Just one final question for people who are interested in learning more about micromobility, or maybe anything else you think is kind of important to know about. What kind of resources or people or organizations would you point them to?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm obviously going to do a bit of a shout out for micromobility.
Yes.
Micromobility.io. Please come join us. We're going to be in Amsterdam on June 1st and 2nd. We'll be in the US in September, and talking about these new vehicles and how they emerge. But also as well, I mean, I think there are so many amazing thinkers on the internet. I really love the work that the Institute for New Economic Thinking does, INET. I think, anybody who's sort of dealing with complexity economics, the Santa Fe Institute, and folks like Bill Gurley and Josh Wolf, who I think are kind of amazing investors, and thinking about the world of investing from this lens, I think are really fascinating and well worth your time looking at.
Great. So thank you again, Oliver, for sharing your time and knowledge with us. You've given us a lot to think about and consider. And thank you very much for your time today, our viewers. We look forward to seeing you at our next productivity talk. To get updated, please subscribe to our YouTube channel or follow us on Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, etc. I hope everyone stays safe, happy, and productive. Thanks.
And fantastic. And thank you so much for the opportunity. It's been an absolute joy to join you. And
Great.
I didn't know much about the APO when I began, but I do now, and I really love that it exists, and very, very happy to have contributed.
Great.
Thanks.